Who is really behind the chaos in Burkina Faso? Is it the insurgents, or is someone else pulling the strings? Amid all the chaos, Burkina Faso suddenly managed to regain control of 70% of its territory. So, was it sheer luck, or was there a force at play all along? And most importantly, who was behind this? Let's find out. Let's start with the basics. How did Burkina Faso lose 40% of its territory to insurgents in the first place? Was it simply bad luck, or was there something more sinister at play? The insurgency in Burkina Faso didn't spring out of nowhere, and the narrative that it's purely the work of Islamist militants doesn't hold up under closer scrutiny. The truth is, insurgencies don't grow this powerful without external factors at work. Burkina Faso's collapse wasn't just a matter of local instability. It was exacerbated, if not outright manufactured, by the meddling hands of foreign powers. But here's the real question. Who benefits from the destabilization of a country like Burkina Faso? We've heard a lot about the role of France in this region, but very few are willing to confront the uncomfortable truth. France's involvement hasn't been about protecting Burkina Faso. It's about protecting their interests in the region. Under the guise of humanitarian assistance and counterinsurgency, France has been entrenching its influence, ensuring that Burkina Faso remains weak and dependent. This is where Operation Barkhane comes into play, a military intervention supposedly aimed at curbing insurgency, but one that instead allowed extremists to spread like wildfire. Was this incompetence or something more deliberate? Many locals are beginning to suspect the latter. The insurgency thrived in this chaos, allowing groups in the AQIM and the ISGS to expand their reach. But instead of asking the obvious question of why these groups grew so powerful under France's watch, Western powers pushed the narrative that more intervention was needed. More boots on the ground, more military spending, more foreign control. And it worked. For a time at least, Burkina Faso remained a playground for Western powers, all the while losing ground to insurgents. But then came a twist no one saw coming. Ukraine was implicated. In a shocking speech at the UN General Assembly, Burkina Faso's foreign minister accused Ukraine of supporting insurgencies in the Sahel. At first glance, this accusation seems absurd. Why would a country embroiled in its conflict be involved in another continent's problems? But the accusation raises an important point. Global geopolitics are far more complex than they appear on the surface. Ukraine's involvement in the Sahel might be part of a broader game, one where Africa's instability benefits other regions by diverting attention, resources, and focus away from their conflicts. Also, because of Russia's close ties with Burkina Faso, for Ukraine, the attacks on Africa started to make more sense. From France to Ukraine, the hidden players behind Burkina Faso's insurgency are slowly being exposed. But as the world looks to point fingers, Burkina Faso itself has started to fight back, reclaiming control over its territory and rewriting the rules of the game. And how did they do it? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. It all starts with a simple action, withdrawing from ECOWAS. And why did Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger break away from the so-called protective umbrella of France and ECOWAS to form the alliance of Sahel states AES? The answer is simple: they had to. The Sahel region was engulfed in flames, and neither France nor ECOWAS was putting them out. Both seemed content to let the fire spread as long as it suited their agendas. So Burkina Faso and its neighbors took matters into their own hands. The AES wasn't just another military pact, it was a bold declaration of independence from the old colonial ties and power structures that had held these nations back. The AES was born out of a deep frustration with the failures of Western interventions, which had not only failed to curb insurgency, but often exacerbated it. By pooling their military resources and coordinating their actions, Burkina Faso and its allies began retaking territory, starting with the Liptako-Gourma region, long a haven for insurgent activity. But the AES wasn't just about military might. These nations understood that to truly reclaim their future, they needed to build a stronger economic foundation. This is where the economic integration aspect of the AES comes in. Plans for a common market, a joint investment bank, and a framework for the free movement of people and goods were set into motion. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. Instead of relying on foreign aid and intervention, these nations would work together to create their economic power base. What made the AES particularly threatening to Western powers wasn't just its military success. It was its audacious plan to forge a new kind of economic and political unity in Africa. With Burkina Faso at the forefront, the alliance began laying the groundwork for a future where African nations could stand on their own without the need for Western approval or support. This was more than just a regional alliance. It was a statement to the world that Africa was ready to reclaim its destiny. The AES's success in reclaiming territory and building a new economic framework sent shockwaves through Western capitals. Now the question is, why was France not given a second chance? Why did the nations immediately make AES?
We also need to usher in reforms and development initiatives which will lead to shared prosperity and economic and social progress which is sustainable. These are all areas of focus of our president, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. And with his leadership and far-sightedness, we shall prevail.
Let's be real. France's intervention in the Sahel wasn't about saving Burkina Faso. It was about saving face and keeping a hold on its former colonies. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. France's involvement in the Sahel was more about destabilizing the region than stabilizing it. After all, if Burkina Faso were truly at peace, why would they need France? It's a dirty game, but one that France has played for centuries. Operation Barkhane was supposed to be France's big push to wipe out insurgent groups. But after years of military presence, the insurgency didn't disappear. It spread. And many in Burkina Faso started to ask the hard questions. If France's goal was to stabilize the region, why were jihadists still gaining ground? Was France simply incompetent, or was there something more deliberate at play? The people of Burkina Faso began to see through the facade. France wasn't there to help. They were there to ensure that Burkina Faso remained weak and dependent. The military junta that took control of the country recognized this and began distancing themselves from France, instead forging new alliances with countries like Russia and Turkey. These weren't just geopolitical moves, they were statements. Burkina Faso was no longer going to play by the old rules dictated by its former colonial masters. This shift away from France didn't come without consequences. The West, particularly France, started to panic. Their grip on the Sahel was loosening, and the success of the AES was proof that Africa could handle its affairs. The West's strategy of maintaining influence through military intervention was falling apart, and Burkina Faso was leading the charge in exposing the cracks in the system. But there's another layer to this story. As France's influence in Burkina Faso waned, the question of whether other Western nations would fill the void remained. Would the United States, Britain, or other European powers step in to maintain control, or would they let Africa chart its course? The success of the AES made it clear that Africa no longer needed to rely on Western intervention. But the West wasn't going to let go of its influence without a fight. In this situation comes the UN Security Council. Can they do anything about it? The UN Security Council is supposed to be the world's ultimate arbiter of peace and security. But let's be honest, the current structure is nothing more than a relic of a bygone era, designed to protect the interests of a handful of powerful nations while ignoring the needs of the rest. Burkina Faso's push for reform of the UN Security Council isn't just about giving Africa a bigger voice. It's about dismantling a system that has failed to address the real threats facing nations like Burkina Faso. The UN, much like France, has proven itself incapable of solving the crises in Africa. When it comes to addressing insurgency, organized crime, and the exploitation of resources, the UN has been woefully ineffective. This isn't just incompetence, it's systemic. The Security Council, dominated by a few global powers, isn't equipped to deal with the complexities of modern African politics, and Burkina Faso knows this. This is why Burkina Faso has started to look beyond the traditional structures of global governance. The AES is a direct response to the failures of the international community. Whether the UN reforms or not, Burkina Faso and its allies have made it clear. They're not waiting around for the world to catch up. They're building their alliances, creating their economic systems, and taking control of their futures. The push for UN reform isn't just about Africa. It's about dismantling a system that has kept the continent in a state of dependency for far too long. But here's the catch. The West isn't ready to let go of its power, and that's why the battle for reform will be long and arduous. So what future holds for Burkina Faso? Burkina Faso's resurgence isn't an isolated event. It's a symbol of a larger movement across Africa. The alliance of Sahel states represents more than just a military and economic coalition. It represents a new kind of African unity. No longer content to be at the mercy of Western powers, African nations are starting to realize that they can chart their course. Burkina Faso is showing the world that Africa can reclaim its destiny without the need for Western intervention. The success of the AES has sent shockwaves through Western capitals. No longer can France, the United States, or any other global power claim that Africa needs their help to survive. Africa is more than capable of taking care of itself. And the success of Burkina Faso in reclaiming its territory and stabilizing its government is proof of that. As Burkina Faso and its neighbors continue to build a new future through the AES, other African nations are watching closely. Will this new model of African unity spread across the continent? And if it does, what will the consequences be for the old order that has long dominated Africa? This is the dawn of a new era for Burkina Faso, and by extension, for Africa. The old rules are being rewritten, and the future looks brighter than ever for nations willing to take control of their destinies. The West may have had its day, but that day is ending. Burkina Faso is leading the charge into a future where Africa no longer waits for permission to succeed. It simply takes what's rightfully its own. In the end, we must ask. We know how vocal Burkina Faso is about foreign powers affecting Africa. So how will the West react to this? Will they take it lightly, or will they respond with aggression? The West, particularly France and other former colonial powers, will not take Burkina Faso's newfound assertiveness lightly. Historically, when African nations have tried to break free from Western influence, the response has been far from passive. Whether through economic sanctions, political meddling, or even direct military interventions, the West has a history of pushing back hard when its interests are threatened. This time, it's no different. Burkina Faso, along with Mali and Niger, is challenging a status quo that has kept the West in control of Africa's vast resources for decades. The Sahel region, rich in minerals like gold and uranium, has long been a site of Western exploitation, and any attempt to disrupt this flow of resources is bound to provoke a strong response. France's economic interests, for instance, extend beyond just security concerns. They rely heavily on the natural resources found in Burkina Faso and its neighboring countries. Uranium, for example, is crucial for France's nuclear energy sector, which supplies a significant portion of the country's electricity. If Burkina Faso and its allies successfully manage to cut off or control access to these resources, the West could face serious economic repercussions. Moreover, with the alliance of Sahel states growing stronger, the West faces the potential collapse of its influence in an entire region. Historically, when African nations have tried to assert control over their resources or shift away from Western dominance, the response has often been swift and aggressive. Take, for example, the fate of Libya under Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi's attempt to unite African nations through initiatives like the African Union and the proposed gold-backed African currency, challenging the dominance of the US dollar and euro, led to intense pressure from Western powers. Ultimately, this culminated in a NATO-led intervention that resulted in Gaddafi's death and the country's descent into chaos. A stark reminder of how far the West is willing to go when its interests are threatened. In the case of Burkina Faso, it's not hard to imagine a similar playbook being used. Economic sanctions may be the first step, targeting key members of the Alliance of Sahel states, restricting access to international financial markets, and freezing assets. These nations, heavily reliant on external trade and aid, could find themselves economically isolated, facing a tightening stranglehold by international institutions like the IMF and World Bank, which are often influenced by Western governments. But sanctions are only one tool. The West also excels at creating divisions from within. Internal strife could be stoked by external actors, with opposition groups receiving funding and support from Western governments under the guise of promoting democracy and human rights. This is a tactic we've seen before. support for opposition groups, or even insurgencies that serve Western interests. These moves could destabilize the very governments trying to break free from Western control, reigniting conflicts and weakening the unity that has been built in the region. There's also the possibility of military involvement. We've seen time and again how the West, particularly the US and France, intervene under the banner of counterinsurgency or peacekeeping, when in reality, it's about reasserting control. France has long maintained a military presence in Africa, and while Operation Barkhane may have officially ended, that doesn't mean France has given up on its military footprint in the Sahel. If the situation in the region escalates, we could see new military initiatives justified by the need to combat insurgency. But in reality, it could be about curbing the power of the AES and re-establishing Western dominance. Furthermore, we can't overlook the role of media and international opinion. Western media outlets have historically played a crucial role in shaping global narratives. In the case of Burkina Faso, we could see an intensified media campaign portraying the leaders of the AES as authoritarian, undemocratic, or even corrupt, framing them as the new despots of Africa. By controlling the narrative, the West could undermine the legitimacy of these governments on the international stage, making it easier to justify interventions, whether economic or military. Another angle that might come into play is the West's ability to influence global institutions. Organizations like the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank have long been tools through which Western powers exerted control over developing nations. Burkina Faso's call for reform of the UN Security Council won't be welcomed by these powers, and we can expect efforts to block any real reform that would diminish their influence. They might also use these institutions to pressure Burkina Faso and its allies economically, politically, and diplomatically, ensuring that their voices are silenced or marginalized on the global stage. On the diplomatic front, Western countries will likely seek to divide the alliance of Sahel states by offering selective incentives, aid packages, trade deals, or security partnerships to individual members of the alliance, attempting to break their unity. It's the classic strategy of divide and conquer, a tactic that has been used repeatedly in Africa to prevent solidarity and weaken collective bargaining power. In this way, the West could isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically while co-opting other nations back into the fold of Western influence. Ultimately, the West's response will not be benign. They have too much to lose, economically, geopolitically, and strategically. The real question is not whether the West will respond, but how aggressively and through what means. Whether through economic strangulation, internal destabilization, military aggression, or media manipulation, the West will attempt to reassert its influence over Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel region. The stakes are simply too high for them to stand by as Africa reclaims its power and autonomy. So now that you know who's really behind Burkina Faso's insurgency, are you still convinced it's just a local insurgency problem? Was it ever really about extremists, or was the real enemy hiding in plain sight all along? Let us know in the comment section. Will Western tactics work now? Does France still look like a savior, or do you see the cracks in its facade? With the alliance of Sahel states rising, do you believe the West can still control Africa the way it once did? And now that Burkina Faso has shown the world what real self-reliance looks like, how long before other African nations follow suit and finally break free from Western manipulation? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.